If you study history carefully, you begin to notice something fascinating. The greatest transfers of wealth rarely happen when people feel confident. They happen during confusion, during uncertainty, during moments when the majority of people are distracted, emotionally reactive, or simply unable to see the larger pattern unfolding around them. And right now, whether people realize it or not, we are moving through one of those moments. The rules that shaped the last 20 years are changing. The financial system is changing. The way money moves is changing. Even the definition of value itself is beginning to change. And most people are still looking at the world through an outdated lens, expecting the future to behave like the past. But history doesn't work that way. Every major cycle eventually reaches a turning point. Debt grows too large. Institutions become stressed. New technologies emerge. Global power shifts begin accelerating beneath the surface. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, wealth starts moving from one group of people to another. Not because of luck, but because some people recognize the shift early, while others deny it until it becomes unavoidable. What's happening now is bigger than a normal market cycle, bigger than a temporary recession, bigger than politics. We are witnessing the early stages of a structural transformation in the global economy. And the people who understand it first may have opportunities that only appear once in a generation. The strange part is, the biggest opportunities almost never feel comfortable in the beginning. They feel uncertain. They feel controversial. They feel difficult to believe. Because when the world is changing rapidly, clarity usually belongs to the few before it belongs to the many. Most people think wealth is built during stable times. They believe fortunes are created when everything feels predictable, when the economy is strong, when headlines are optimistic, and when everyone around them feels confident about the future. But if you really study history carefully, you begin to notice something almost uncomfortable about the way the world actually works. The biggest wealth shifts in history almost always begin quietly, during periods of uncertainty. Not when people feel safe, when people feel confused. And that's exactly why most people miss them. Because human nature hasn't changed. People wait for certainty before they move. They wait for permission. They wait for experts to agree. They wait until the opportunity already feels obvious. But by the time something becomes obvious to the majority, the real shift has usually already happened beneath the surface. Think about how every major transition in history unfolded. Whether it was technology, real estate, energy, markets, or entire economic systems, the people who benefited the most were rarely the people reacting late. They were the people who recognized patterns early, while everyone else was still emotionally attached to the old system. And what makes moments like this so important is that they don't look dramatic at first. They look confusing. One day inflation rises unexpectedly, then debt levels explode, then governments begin changing policies, then currencies weaken, then industries that once looked unstoppable begin slowing down while completely different sectors quietly start attracting capital. Most people look at these events separately, but the people who truly understand cycles know these things are deeply interconnected. That's how major economic transitions begin, quietly. And what's happening right now may be one of the most important transitions we've seen in decades. Because beneath all the daily noise, beneath the political arguments, beneath the headlines designed to distract people emotionally, capital is already moving. Power is already shifting. Entire financial structures are slowly being repriced in real time. And most people still think the future will look exactly like the recent past because psychologically, that feels safer to believe. But wealth has never rewarded comfort for very long. In every major cycle, uncertainty creates fear for the majority, but opportunity for the minority willing to understand what's actually changing before the crowd fully sees it. One of the most dangerous things about human nature is that people only believe change after the consequences become impossible to ignore. Until then, They cling to what feels familiar. They assume the systems around them will continue functioning the way they always have, because psychologically, certainty feels safer than adaptation. And that's why so many people react too late during major wealth shifts. Not because they lack intelligence, because they are emotionally anchored to the past. You see this happen in every cycle. When technology changes, most people dismiss it in the beginning. When markets become overheated, people convince themselves this time is different. When debt grows too large, they assume governments will somehow maintain stability forever. People naturally want the future to resemble the world they already understand. But history shows us something very different. The world changes in cycles, and every cycle eventually reaches a point where old assumptions stop working. What makes this moment especially important is that the signals are already visible. You can see stress building across global systems. You can see how rapidly technology is changing the value of labor. You can see capital flowing differently than it did even a few years ago. Entire industries that once dominated are becoming vulnerable, while new sectors quietly gain strength underneath the surface. But because these changes happen gradually at first, most people ignore them until the effects become dramatic. That's always how transitions unfold. Slowly, then suddenly. And by the time the majority finally recognizes what's happening, fear usually replaces opportunity. Because once people feel the consequences directly, inflation affecting daily life, jobs becoming uncertain, markets becoming unstable, purchasing power weakening, they stop thinking strategically and start reacting emotionally. And emotional reactions are often what separate people from long-term wealth creation during periods of transition. The people who navigate these moments successfully tend to think differently. They focus less on headlines and more on patterns, less on short-term comfort and more on structural change. They understand that uncertainty itself often signals that a larger shift is already underway beneath the surface. And right now, many people are still waiting for the world to go back to normal, without realizing that what they considered normal may have been the temporary phase, not the permanent one. If there's one pattern that repeats throughout history more consistently than almost anything else, it's that economic systems move in cycles, not straight lines, not permanent expansions, not endless prosperity. Every system eventually reaches a point where the forces that once created growth begin creating instability instead. And most people never notice the turning point while it's happening. Because when you're living inside a cycle, the current reality always feels permanent. During strong markets, people believe growth will continue forever. During periods of easy money, debt feels harmless. During technological booms, valuations stop feeling connected to reality. Human beings naturally project the present into the future because uncertainty is uncomfortable to process. But cycles don't care about comfort. They continue moving whether people recognize them or not. And when major transitions begin, the signals rarely appear all at once. They emerge slowly through interconnected changes that most people dismiss individually. Rising debt levels, increasing wealth inequality, shifts in global power, currency instability, technological disruption, declining trust in institutions, changes in labor markets. These aren't isolated events. They're often symptoms of a much larger structural transition unfolding underneath the surface of the economy. That's why some of the greatest wealth opportunities in history were created during periods that initially looked chaotic or uncertain, because transitions create repricing. Old systems weaken, new systems emerge. Capital begins flowing toward what the future values most, not what the past rewarded. And the people who recognize that early position themselves differently, while the majority remains psychologically attached to the previous cycle. You can already see elements of this happening now. Artificial intelligence is beginning to reshape industries faster than most people expected. Governments around the world are carrying debt burdens that would have seemed impossible decades ago. Traditional financial assumptions are being challenged in real time. Entire sectors that once looked invincible are starting to show vulnerability, while assets connected to scarcity, energy, infrastructure, technology, and strategic resources are attracting increasing attention from long-term capital. But what makes moments like this difficult is that transitions feel messy while they're happening. People want simple answers during uncertain times. They want clarity, they want stability. But historically, periods of massive change rarely feel stable in the moment. They feel emotionally exhausting, confusing, unpredictable. And that confusion is often where the largest opportunities quietly begin forming before the majority fully understands what cycle they're actually living through. The strange thing about uncertainty is that most people automatically interpret it as danger. The moment markets become unstable, headlines become negative, or the future feels unclear, human psychology shifts into survival mode. People stop thinking long-term. They stop looking for opportunity. They become emotionally reactive. And once fear takes control, decision-making becomes incredibly short-sighted. But if you study history carefully, some of the greatest opportunities ever created emerged from periods that initially felt deeply uncomfortable. That's because uncertainty changes behavior. When people feel confident, they chase trends. They follow the crowd. They assume the system will continue rewarding the same strategies it rewarded yesterday. But during periods of instability, weaknesses inside the system begin revealing themselves. Fragile industries start breaking down. Overvalued assets begin losing confidence. Economic imbalances that were ignored during prosperous times suddenly become impossible to hide. And while the majority focuses entirely on fear, capital quietly starts repositioning itself toward the future. That's the part most people miss. Major wealth shifts don't happen because everyone suddenly becomes optimistic at the same time. They happen because a small number of people recognize that periods of disruption force the world to reorganize itself. New technologies emerge faster, governments change priorities, financial systems adapt under pressure, consumer behavior changes. Entire industries are revalued based on what becomes strategically important in the next cycle rather than the last one. You can already feel this process beginning now. The global economy feels more unstable than it did a decade ago. People are questioning institutions more openly. Artificial intelligence is changing expectations around work and productivity. Debt levels continue expanding across major economies. Geopolitical tensions are influencing energy, trade, and currency systems in ways most people still underestimate. And beneath all of that uncertainty, one of the largest reallocations of wealth and power in modern history may already be underway. But emotionally, this period feels uncomfortable, and discomfort causes hesitation. People naturally want certainty before they act. Yet history repeatedly shows that the biggest opportunities rarely appear during periods of certainty. They emerge during confusion, skepticism, and transition, when most people are too distracted by fear to think clearly about where the world is actually heading. Because fear has a way of hiding opportunity in plain sight. And the people who learn how to stay rational while others become emotional often see the world very differently during moments when entire systems are beginning to shift beneath the surface. There's a moment in every major economic transition where the future quietly begins rewarding a completely different type of person. And most people don't recognize that moment until years later, when the results have already become visible to everyone else. Because the truth is, wealth is rarely built by people who simply follow stability. It's often built by people who recognize change early, before the majority feels emotionally comfortable accepting it. If you look back throughout history, the individuals who benefited the most from major shifts were not necessarily the smartest people in the room. They were often the people most willing to adapt while others remained psychologically attached to the previous cycle. When industries changed, they adapted early. When technology disrupted old systems, they paid attention before the crowd. When markets became irrational, they focused on long-term positioning instead of short-term emotion. And what separated them from everyone else wasn't luck, it was perspective. Most people are trained to react to what already happened. They wait for proof. They wait for headlines to confirm the trend. They wait until the opportunity feels safe enough to explain to other people without criticism. But by then, The asymmetrical advantage often disappears because the crowd has finally arrived. That's why moments like this matter so much. Right now, we are living through overlapping transitions that could reshape how wealth is created over the next decade. Artificial intelligence is changing labor markets faster than expected. Governments are carrying debt burdens that continue growing larger. Global power dynamics are shifting. Entire industries are being repriced in real time. And beneath all of it, capital is moving toward what the future is likely to value most. But emotionally, this period feels uncomfortable, and discomfort causes hesitation. People naturally want certainty before they act. Yet history repeatedly shows that the biggest opportunities rarely appear during periods of certainty. They emerge during confusion, skepticism, and transition, when most people are too distracted by fear to think clearly about where the world is actually heading. The dangerous thing about massive structural shifts is that they usually become obvious only after the majority has already missed the early phase of the opportunity. And by that point, people stop asking thoughtful questions and start chasing momentum emotionally. That's why understanding cycles matters, because when you begin recognizing how economic transitions unfold, you stop viewing uncertainty the same way. You start realizing that periods of instability often contain hidden signals about what the next era may reward. You pay closer attention to where capital is moving, where innovation is accelerating, and where global systems are quietly restructuring themselves beneath the surface. And what's happening right now may eventually be remembered as one of those defining moments where the world slowly transitioned from one economic era into another, while most people were still waiting for things to return to normal. The people who recognize these shifts early are rarely the loudest people in the room. They're usually the ones observing patterns carefully, while everyone else remains emotionally consumed by daily noise. And as this transition continues unfolding, the difference between reacting emotionally and thinking strategically may become one of the most important financial advantages a person can have in the years ahead.